I've been asked, we've been given a bit of context now, and I've been asked to talk about why there is no alternative to decarbonisation. And I'd like to maybe just start with the issue of climate change and just a reminder of a few of the basic facts which frame this whole issue. So first, concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen from 280 parts per million in 1850, where it was more or less stable for about 700,000 years, to over 400 parts per million in 2015. That's due largely to emissions caused by the combustion of fossil fuels and by deforestation. That CO2, and obviously other greenhouse gases as well, remain in the atmosphere for 100 years. They change the balance of the Earth system and they cause the planet to warm. Since 1900, the planet has warmed by approximately 0.85 degrees, and in Austria, we've seen warming of about 2 degrees centigrade in that time. And in terms of the policy framework, the international community has agreed upon limiting global warming to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius to avoid dangerous climate change. So that kind of frames the debate, and Josh has already mentioned the carbon budget. And I think I'd just like to illustrate briefly sort of how small the window of opportunity is that we have to deal with climate change with the carbon budget. Very briefly, by means of an explanation, based on observations of sort of past climate change, models can determine the sensitivity of the climate to CO2 emissions, and that basically allows us to calculate how many emissions we can afford for a certain level of temperature change. And for a 66% chance of reaching the 2-degree target for the period 2011 to 2050, that means cumulatively, globally, we can emit about 1,000 gigatons of CO2. Well, it's now 2015, and in the last 4 years, we've emitted 150 gigatons. That leaves us 850. So just briefly, a little bit of mathematics. If we take the emerging economies in the so-called developing countries, we assume they have a little window until 2025, a little bit more economic growth, and their carbon emissions peak in 2025, and they reduce their carbon emissions by 10% per year from then on. And just to give a bit of context, the EU is currently reducing their emissions by about 1% per year, so we're talking about massive emission reductions here. Cumulatively, they emit 650 gigatons. You add developed countries. If they start reducing their emissions by 10% per year from 2015, they emit 130 gigatons. If we put the same time frame, so 2025, it's 220 gigatons, and our 2 degrees target is gone. That's just to illustrate how small the window of opportunity is and how rapidly we need to decarbonize our economy. In terms of global fossil reserves, which I'm going to come to a little bit later, but just to give you an idea, that means we can burn a maximum of 15% of coal reserves, 50% of gas reserves, and about 60% of oil reserves. What happens if we don't reach the 2-degree target? There's been numerous studies that have looked at that issue. Going back to 2006, Nicholas Stern reported to the UK government, if we take action on climate change now, that costs about 1% of global GDP. If we wait until later, the impacts of climate change will cost the global economy between 5 and 20%. Similar study has recently been done for Austria. That looks, under a medium climate scenario, what the costs of climate change impacts that are currently about €1 billion per year in Austria. They would rise in 2050 to around €9 billion a year. And finally, the Austrian assessment on climate change published last year has had a look at sort of potential consequences of climate change in Austria. And I think we all remember this very, very hot summer that we've just been through. And that's just a taste of what things could be like in the future. So extreme heat stress, particularly for elderly people and the very young. Huge amount of damages due to droughts in agriculture, and obviously in years of extreme weather events, flooding and so on, costs considerably higher. That's the scenario if we don't reach the 2-degree target. So I'm sure you're all ready for a bit of good news. The really good news comes later. I'm just going to start with a bit of a taster of what's been going on recently. So there are a few positive signs. The heads of state and government at the recent G7 meeting in Germany pledged to decarbonize the global economy by 2100. Now that's a positive first step, but I think the numbers I just presented show that that is clearly too little, too late. Also, we see commitments coming in prior to the climate change conference taking place in Paris later on this year, commitments from the EU, from the US, from China. Also positive first steps, but they're far off from being enough. And I think there's one central issue that I'd like to point to why a lot of these efforts aren't enough. We still have one enormous problem, I'd say an elephant in the room, maybe an energy elephant in the room, and that's subsidies. Huge subsidies for fossil fuels and for nuclear energy. Subsidies that give these old forms of energy a structural advantage over clean forms of energy that we need so badly in order to limit climate change, which I've just been talking about. So just to give you a couple of figures, the International Monetary Fund recently calculated, and I'm assuming these calculations are probably conservative, that globally fossil fuels are subsidized to the tune of $5.3 trillion per year. That's about a third of GDP in Europe. Here you just see the breakdown of subsidies for the major companies. And here the subsidies broken down in terms of types. So just to illustrate the first couple, local pollution, that's anything from oil spills, from emissions from coal plants, emissions caused by cars, as we're talking about the issue of urban mobility, so obviously cars emitting particulate matter, and the huge costs to human health that these entail. Global warming calculates the future costs that these emissions, which will remain in the atmosphere for 100 years and more, will cause in terms of impacts of climate change. Now, obviously, I wouldn't work for Greenpeace if I didn't talk briefly also about the issue of nuclear energy. Just to mention that if you include not only the direct costs that you pay for a unit of power, but also the externalized costs. What am I talking about with externalized costs? So costs that aren't included in the price of power, such as the contribution to global warming of CO2 emissions from uranium mining, from constructing power plants, from operating power plants, from waste disposal, but also the costs of a potential nuclear disaster, then nuclear energy becomes the most expensive form of power production there is. I'd also like to add that I mentioned the issue of waste disposal. Fact is that we still actually have no solution for the issue of nuclear waste. And you're going to see in a minute why I'm pointing so much to this issue of costs. Just a couple more. So in 1954, then US President Dwight Eisenhower predicted that one day nuclear energy would be too cheap to meter. A recent study by the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US has described atomic energy as actually being too expensive to finance. That same study analyzed US expansion plans for nuclear power in 2009 and estimated the required state subsidies for those plans at between $400 billion and $1.6 trillion. Last example, something we've been working on recently at Greenpeace, the planned power plant in Paks in Hungary, only viable if power prices rise by 75% in the next 10 years. They're only going to rise by 25%. The Hungarian taxpayer and the EU are going to pick up the tab of between 400 and 600 million euros per year. Now, why am I talking about all this issue of costs and subsidies? Well, there's two reasons. The first is that these are huge amounts of money we're talking about, money that we could be using for energy efficiency, for renewable energy, for creating these cities of the future that we've been talking about. I think basically what we can see is that the energy transition is inevitable, essentially. It's not just inevitable from a climate change perspective, it's also inevitable from an economic perspective. That also means that where, how, and who produces energy is rapidly changing from centralized energy production in large power plants by a few companies, such as in the form of atomic energy or large coal-fired power plants, to decentral production in many, many, many small power plants by millions of producers. What does all this mean for the global political framework and for the climate change conference in Paris? I think many sectors of the economy and also civil society has realized that things are changing. I think it's time for politics to also follow suit. Just paying lip service to 2-degree target alone is not enough. We need a deal in Paris that sets the political framework for the complete decarbonisation of our economy and the global energy transition. That's also why Greenpeace's central demand for the climate conference in Paris is 100% renewable energy by 2050. This was an action we did in Vienna in front of Hofburg just last Saturday. And just to finish up, a bit of good news. There's a global movement happening. I think that became quite clear. This is the People's March in New York City, the People's Climate March in New York City in September last year. Marches took place in cities all across the world. And I think this will become clear again in Paris in December. I think there's also a growing awareness for the fact that investments in fossil energy are not only an ethical problem and a problem in the context of climate change, but they also present a huge financial risk. This is a graphic I've just borrowed from a campaign from The Guardian, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But just to give you a fact and a figure about the financial risk related to fossil fuels. In the past 5 years, the top 50 oil and gas companies worldwide and the top 50 coal companies worldwide have lost 30% of their value. Now, obviously, that's due in large parts to declining energy prices, but we see a trend, and this is a trend that's set to continue. And it's set to continue because, obviously, I mentioned at the beginning in relation to the carbon budget that we need to leave a very large parts of fossil reserves in the ground. That's going to seriously impact the financial value of fossil fuel companies because this financial value is measured against these fossil reserves. That's why people are starting to divest their assets from these companies. That's also why the organization 350.org and The Guardian newspaper started this campaign, a campaign which so far has prompted Bill Gates to divest $2 billion, to invest $2 billion into renewables, which has prompted Norwegian state pension funds to divest $10 billion from coal. And at the moment, we see divestment commitments across the world of about $2.5 trillion. So there's really a trend happening. Many other divestment decisions from local governments, from companies, from universities and churches have followed in the past few months. Finally, I think 100% renewable energy is not only technologically feasible, it's the only economically and ecologically sound choice we have. It's going to create millions of jobs around the world. If you want to read any more about that, I can warmly recommend our recently updated Energy Revolution. And just a couple of graphs to finish off. This is the growth of solar PV over the last 10 years. Now, I think that's a growth rate which 10 years ago no one would have predicted. Similar graph for wind power. For large parts of the year, wind and solar energy now cost less than fossil energy. In fact, in 2013, the new installed capacity of renewable power surpassed for the first time the new installed capacity of fossil fuels. So I'd just like to finish off by saying I think there's no alternative to decarbonisation, and the future is renewable. Thanks very much for listening.